The rain fell without mercy on the Vance estate. Arthur Vance, the media titan, was finally being laid to rest under the cold European soil. Dozens of black umbrellas shielded the elite, but none shielded the fractured family. The three Vance siblings stood together, yet entirely apart in the downpour. Richard Vance, the eldest, stared straight ahead. His tailored black suit remained immaculate, his jaw clenched, calculating the shifting power dynamics before the dirt even settled. A few feet away stood Clara. Her expression was perfectly composed beneath a black veil, but her sharp blue eyes darted toward the family's private lawyer. Leo, the youngest, arrived late. His tie was loose, smelling faintly of expensive bourbon, an intentional disrespect to the patriarch who had constantly belittled him. The wooden casket was lowered. There were no tears shed among the heirs. Only the heavy, suffocating silence of an empire waiting to be claimed. As the ceremony concluded, Richard turned sharply, not offering a glance to his sister or brother. The unspoken war for the trust fund had officially begun. Clara watched Richard leave, a subtle, cold smile crossing her lips. She knew the eldest son expected a smooth transition, but she had her own preparations. Leo lingered by the grave alone, the rain soaking his unkempt hair. He pulled a silver flask from his coat, taking a long, bitter drink. The towering silhouette of the Vance Manor loomed in the background, a fortress of secrets. Inside its walls, the true legacy of Arthur Vance awaited them. Inside the dimly lit estate library, the air was thick with tension. The three Vance siblings gathered around a massive oak table, waiting for the final reading. Mr. Sterling, the family's longtime attorney, adjusted his round glasses. His hands slightly trembled as he broke the heavy wax seal on Arthur Vance's last will. Richard sat perfectly upright, his hands steepled. He anticipated a clear transfer of power, expecting the entire media conglomerate to fall seamlessly into his control. Clara watched Sterling closely from a leather armchair. Her sharp blue eyes didn't miss the subtle hesitation in the old lawyer's demeanor. She sensed a trap. Leo slouched on a velvet sofa near the window, ignoring the proceedings. He stared out at the pouring rain, quietly swirling the remaining liquor in his glass. Sterling cleared his throat, reading the heavily legalistic document. The vast estate and the company shares were not divided. Instead, everything was placed into a blind trust. The room grew colder. Sterling revealed that the trust was entirely frozen. No assets could be liquidated or accessed by any of the three siblings. Richard's facade cracked. His jaw tightened dangerously as he leaned forward, demanding an immediate explanation. A frozen trust meant absolute financial paralysis for his ambitious plans. Clara remained silent, but her knuckles turned white as she gripped the armrest. The calculated future she had meticulously planned was suddenly dissolving into thin air. Sterling wiped his brow. He stated coldly that the freeze would remain in place until the arrival of the fourth legitimate heir, a name unknown to them all. The massive oak doors of the library closed heavily. Richard followed Sterling into the dimly lit, marble-floored hallway, his footsteps echoing ominously against the stone. Sterling walked quickly, his leather briefcase clutched tightly against his chest. He knew the eldest Vance sibling was not a man accustomed to being denied. Richard caught up, placing a heavy hand on the old lawyer's shoulder. The physical intrusion was a calculated, silent display of dominance. Sterling stopped, adjusting his glasses nervously but refusing to break eye contact. Having served the ruthless patriarch for 30 years, he recognized the exact same coldness in the son. Richard spoke in a low, measured tone, demanding the name of the fourth heir. He subtly offered a highly lucrative consulting fee in exchange for the confidential information. The lawyer shook his head slowly. He explained that the sealed file was secured in an off-site vault, and any early breach would automatically disinherit the entire family. Richard's icy blue eyes narrowed. He stepped closer, invading the older man's personal space, radiating an unspoken, chilling pressure that commanded obedience. Sterling didn't flinch. Instead, he delivered a quiet warning. He told Richard that Arthur Vance had anticipated this exact reaction and had prepared severe countermeasures. The revelation struck Richard. The realization that his father was still controlling them from beyond the grave cast a dark shadow over his unyielding ambition. Sterling turned and walked down the long, empty corridor. Richard watched him disappear into the shadows, realizing this game of succession was far more complex than he had calculated. While Richard tried to force the lawyer's hand, Clara took a far more stealthy approach. She slipped quietly into her late father's private study. The heavy mahogany door clicked shut behind her. She turned the brass lock, ensuring absolute privacy for her unauthorized search. The study was a reflection of Arthur Vance himself, imposing, meticulously organized, and filled with dark, expensive antiques. Clara moved directly to the massive executive desk. She knew the patriarch rarely left anything to chance, hiding his true secrets in plain sight. Her pale hands carefully sifted through leather-bound ledgers and fountain pens, making sure not to disturb the exact placement of any item. Her sharp eyes noticed a subtle inconsistency. A heavy, antique cigar humidor sat slightly off-center on the polished wood surface. Clara lifted the cedar tray inside the box. Beneath the velvet lining, she discovered a seamlessly integrated false bottom. Prying it open with a metal letter opener, she uncovered a small, intricate brass key. It belonged to no standard lock in the manor. She held the key up to the warm glow of the desk lamp. A triumphant, calculating gleam briefly illuminated her sharp blue eyes. Suddenly, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed in the hallway outside. Clara froze instantly, her hand closing tightly around the cold brass key. Miles away from the stifling manor, the youngest Vance heir sought refuge in a different kind of darkness. An exclusive, underground private club in the city center. Leo slouched in a velvet VIP booth, surrounded by empty crystal champagne flutes. He was desperately trying to drown out the memory of the funeral. Oblivious to the true severity of the lawyer's reading, he continued to play the role of the untouchable billionaire playboy. A sharply dressed waiter approached the table, presenting an astronomical bill on a polished silver tray. Without breaking his hollow smile, Leo casually tossed his premium black card onto the tray, not even glancing at the total. A few moments later, the waiter returned. His posture was stiff, the silver tray held tightly in his hands. Leaning in respectfully, the waiter whispered that the transaction had been denied. Leo chuckled, assuming it was a mere clerical error. Annoyed, Leo pulled out a second elite credit card. The waiter processed it immediately on a portable terminal. A red light blinked. Denied again. The pulsing music seemed to fade into a dull roar. The cold reality crashed over Leo. The trust wasn't just restricted, he was entirely cut off. As the stern club manager began to approach the booth, Leo realized he was no longer a king in this world. He was a man cornered by his own debts. Clara held her breath, her back pressed flat against the mahogany door. The heavy footsteps in the corridor paused directly outside the study. A dark shadow loomed in the narrow gap beneath the door frame. After a tortuous moment, the footsteps resumed, slowly fading down the hall. Exhaling quietly, Clara turned her attention back to the room. She approached a massive oil painting of a European landscape hanging on the far wall. Her fingers traced the ornate wooden frame until she found a concealed latch. With a quiet click, the heavy painting swung outward on hidden hinges. Concealed within the stone wall was a vintage steel safe. It possessed no modern keypad, only a single, intricate keyhole matching her newly found prize. Clara inserted the brass key. The metal cold against her skin, she turned it slowly. A heavy, satisfying mechanical clunk echoed in the silent room. She pulled the heavy steel door open. The safe was largely empty, containing no stacks of hidden wealth or precious jewels. Instead, resting in the center was a single, faded velvet box. Inside lay a thick bundle of old, handwritten letters tied with a delicate silk ribbon. Clara carefully untied the ribbon and unfolded the top parchment. The elegant, sweeping handwriting of her late father filled the aged paper. The letter was addressed simply to, "My dearest Evelyn." A cold realization washed over Clara. She had just discovered the name of the fourth heir. The morning sun struggled to pierce the thick, cold fog surrounding the Vance estate. The storm had passed, but the tension remained. A sleek black town car drove slowly up the winding gravel path, stopping before the massive, wrought iron security gates. The heavy car door opened. A striking blonde woman stepped out into the damp European air. Her name was Evelyn. She wore a tailored beige trench coat, her posture impeccably straight. There was no trace of mourning or hesitation in her demeanor. Evelyn approached the intercom. She didn't look like an illegitimate secret, she looked like someone arriving to collect a long overdue debt. Pressing the silver button, she spoke her name clearly to the static-filled speaker. The sound of her voice echoed softly in the quiet morning. Inside the security booth, a uniformed guard checked his clipboard. Finding her name on a highly restricted list, he immediately pressed the release button. The heavy iron gates slowly swung open with a deep, metallic groan, granting her access to the fortress of the Vance family. High above in the manor, Richard watched the driveway from a towering glass window. His morning coffee grew cold in his hand. His icy blue eyes tracked the black car as it proceeded toward the house. The mysterious fourth heir had finally arrived to claim her throne. That evening, the Vance dining room was suffocatingly quiet. The three siblings sat around the sprawling mahogany table, separated by an ocean of distrust. Richard cut into his steak with precise, aggressive motions. Clara merely pushed her food around her plate, while Leo focused entirely on his red wine. The tense silence was shattered by the heavy creak of the dining room's double doors opening. The family's elderly butler stepped aside. Evelyn walked into the room. She had traded her trench coat for a sleek, tailored black evening dress, commanding the space instantly. She did not wait for an invitation or a formal introduction. With measured, confident steps, she bypassed the siblings completely. Evelyn pulled out the chair at the absolute head of the table, the seat that had strictly belonged to Arthur Vance. Richard froze, his silver knife clattering softly against his porcelain plate. His jaw locked in a silent display of pure outrage. Clara's eyes narrowed, observing the newcomer with a cold, calculating gaze. She recognized the undeniable physical resemblance to their father. Leo just smirked, raising his wine glass in a mock toast to the audacity of this beautiful stranger. Evelyn sat down gracefully. She placed a thick, sealed legal folder onto the polished wood, officially declaring her arrival as the fourth heir. The moment dinner concluded, Richard retreated to his private quarters, pacing the dark rug like a caged animal. The sheer audacity of the woman taking his father's seat burned in his mind. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, his hands slightly tense with suppressed anger. Unwilling to surrender the empire to a complete stranger, Richard picked up an encrypted phone from his mahogany desk. Within minutes, the heavy doors opened. Elias, the family's imposing private security director, stepped into the room. Elias was a massive, stoic man who had spent decades managing the Vance family's most confidential affairs. He stood perfectly still, awaiting his orders. Richard slammed a copy of Evelyn's legal folder onto the glass coffee table between them. He demanded a complete, uncompromising background investigation into the mysterious blonde woman. Richard wanted every bank record, every past relationship, and every hidden flaw brought to the surface before the end of the week. Elias didn't ask a single question. He slowly picked up the yellow folder, his expression remaining entirely unreadable. Giving a short, decisive nod, the security chief turned and walked out, leaving Richard alone to plot his next move in the shadows. While her eldest brother relied on his security apparatus, Clara preferred a much more direct and subtle approach. Late that night, she walked silently down the manor's east wing, stopping before the grand doors of the guest suite. Evelyn was waiting. She sat gracefully by a small, antique table, pouring hot tea from a silver pot as if she already owned the house. Clara didn't bother with pleasantries. She walked in and smoothly slid the yellowed, handwritten letter onto the table. Evelyn barely glanced at the aged parchment. She took a slow sip of her tea, her striking blue eyes locking with Clara's. Clara demanded the truth, stating clearly that she knew Evelyn was not a blood relative of the Vance family. Evelyn smiled faintly. She confirmed the suspicion, revealing she was the only daughter of Arthur Vance's original, forgotten business partner. The partner Arthur had systematically bankrupted and erased decades ago to build his massive media empire. Clara's breath hitched slightly. She realized Evelyn wasn't there for a mere inheritance, she was there to collect a financial debt. Evelyn calmly stated that Arthur's overwhelming guilt in his final days had led him to secretly transfer the controlling shares to her, leaving the siblings powerless. The following morning, the battlefield shifted from the antique manor to the glass and steel headquarters of Vance Media. Richard knew Evelyn was an existential threat, but before facing her, he needed to completely consolidate his internal power. He convened an emergency, closed-door meeting with the company's most influential and wealthy shareholders. Sitting at the head of the modern conference table, Richard deployed his charm and his late father's aggressive corporate tactics. He presented carefully curated financial projections, subtly shifting the blame for all recent losses entirely onto Clara's department. Meanwhile, Clara arrived at the executive floor, her heels clicking sharply against the polished marble as she hurried down the corridor. She reached the boardroom, only to find the heavy glass doors electronically locked from the inside, her security keycard flashing red. Through the soundproof glass, she watched helplessly as her brother raised his hand to call for a formal, binding vote. One by one, the older board members raised their hands in agreement, effectively severing Clara from the company's leadership. Richard met her furious gaze through the glass, offering a cold, victorious smile. He had just made the first decisive strike in the family war. While his older siblings fought for control of the boardroom, Leo was desperately trying to maintain his lavish facade. The frozen trust fund had exposed his massive, hidden gambling debts, leaving him completely out of options. He sought out Victor, a notoriously uncompromising underground financier who catered exclusively to desperate elites. They met in the dim, smoke-filled basement of an exclusive billiards club, far from the polished world of Vance Media. Leo tried to project his usual arrogance, asking for a massive, undocumented loan to tide him over. Victor calmly chalked his pool cue. He knew exactly how vulnerable and desperate the youngest Vance heir truly was. The financier agreed to the funds, but he presented a harsh, non-negotiable contract on the green felt table. He demanded Leo's future shares of the Vance estate as collateral, ensuring total financial leverage over the young man. Leo stared at the heavy gold pen. He knew signing the document meant entering a highly dangerous arrangement. But with no other way out, Leo's hand trembled as he signed his name, completely backing himself into a corner. Fresh off his victory in the boardroom, Richard sat behind his massive executive desk, savoring the illusion of absolute power. His triumph was cut short when Clara walked into his office, completely unbothered by her recent, highly public termination. Richard offered a condescending smirk, fully prepared to have security formally escort his sister out of the building. Instead of leaving, Clara casually tossed a photocopy of the aged, handwritten letter onto his polished desk. Richard leaned forward, his arrogant smile rapidly fading as he recognized their late father's distinct handwriting. Clara coldly laid out the truth. She revealed Evelyn's true identity and the existence of the secret controlling shares. Richard's eyes widened in realization. His hostile takeover of the board was entirely meaningless if Evelyn held the absolute majority stake. The foundation of his newly claimed corporate empire was crumbling beneath his feet in a matter of seconds. Clara delivered her ultimatum. She demanded full reinstatement and a co-chair position, or she would permanently ally with Evelyn. Trapped by his own sister's cunning, Richard stared at her in seething, silent defeat. The game had completely changed. While Richard and Clara fiercely debated over the company's scraps, Evelyn remained completely focused on her true objective. She sat alone in the massive estate library, illuminated only by the cold, blue glow of her laptop screen. Evelyn wasn't just there to claim the Vance media empire, she was there to systematically expose its corrupt foundation. Plugging a secure, encrypted drive into her computer, she began running a decryption sequence on the family's private servers. Beside her laptop rested the old, leather-bound accounting ledgers she had uncovered hidden in her guest suite. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, cross-referencing decades of Arthur Vance's handwritten numbers with the modern digital records. The screen flashed with hidden offshore accounts, massive shell corporations, and undeniable proof of historic financial fraud. Arthur hadn't just bankrupted her father, he had built his entire fortune on a fragile house of illegal cards. Evelyn's expression remained perfectly calm as she compiled the devastating evidence into a single, highly explosive digital dossier. With one final click, the file was locked and ready to be deployed. The Vance family had no idea the true storm was already inside their walls. By 8 a.m. the following morning, the digital dossier had been anonymously delivered to every major financial news outlet in the country. The public explosion was immediate. News anchors broke their regular programming to broadcast the massive fraud scandal surrounding Vance Media. Outside the corporate headquarters, a sea of reporters and camera crews swarmed the glass doors, desperately demanding a statement. Inside the executive suite, Richard stared at the television monitors in absolute horror. The company's stock price was actively free-falling. Clara rushed into the room, her usual cold composure completely shattered. She finally realized Evelyn hadn't come to take the throne, she had come to destroy it entirely. Across the city, Leo's phone buzzed aggressively. Every single one of his credit lines, bank accounts, and the trust fund itself were now formally seized by federal authorities. The terrifying reality hit the youngest brother. With zero remaining assets, his new debt to the underground loan shark was now a catastrophic liability. Federal agents carrying thick black briefcases marched into the Vance Media lobby, presenting immediate injunctions and asset freeze orders to the staff. Everything Arthur Vance had built, every hidden account and stolen dollar, was locked away from his children forever. The three siblings were now completely bankrupt. The empire had fallen without a single physical blow being struck. That evening, nature mirrored the absolute chaos of the Vance family. A massive thunderstorm rolled across the isolated European estate. A severe lightning strike hit the local grid, plunging the towering stone manor into complete and sudden darkness. The only remaining source of light was the roaring fireplace in the grand living room, casting long, dancing shadows across the antique walls. Richard sat heavily on a leather sofa. His tie was undone, his expensive suit jacket discarded, his arrogant posture utterly broken. Clara stood by the tall window, watching the heavy rain beat against the glass. Her meticulous corporate plans were entirely ruined. Leo paced the floor frantically. Having fled his apartment to hide from his underground creditors, he drank straight from a crystal whiskey bottle. Soft footsteps echoed on the grand wooden staircase. The three siblings turned silently toward the dark hallway. Evelyn descended slowly, illuminated by the warm, flickering light of a silver candelabra she held in her steady hand. She stepped into the living room, completely unfazed by the heavy storm outside or the intense hostility inside. For the first time, the four heirs were trapped in a single room, entirely stripped of their wealth, their power, and their corporate shields. The silence in the dark living room was deafening. Richard was the first to break it, his voice echoing with absolute bitterness. He aggressively confronted Evelyn, accusing her of conspiring with federal authorities to systematically dismantle their inheritance. Clara stepped forward, her sharp blue eyes narrowing as she questioned the blonde woman's true, underlying motives. Even Leo stopped pacing, leaning heavily against a leather armchair, waiting for the mysterious stranger to defend herself. Evelyn did not raise her voice. She calmly placed her silver candelabra onto the antique wooden coffee table. From beneath her coat, she produced a thick, physical copy of the explosive financial dossier she had compiled. She dropped the heavy stack of papers onto the table. The sharp slap of paper hitting would silence the room immediately. Evelyn coldly explained that she hadn't stolen their fortune. She simply exposed the fact that the fortune never truly belonged to them. The document detailed how Arthur Vance had built his media empire through massive offshore shell companies and clandestine wire transfers. She revealed the final truth: the entire Vance estate was nothing but a fragile financial illusion, created to hide his original, massive debt. Richard refused to accept the reality. His hands shook as he snatched the thick dossier from the coffee table. He frantically flipped through the pages, holding the documents close to the flickering firelight to read the cold, hard numbers. His icy blue eyes scanned over the massive deficits, the hidden liabilities, and the astronomical loans his father had secretly taken. The truth was undeniable. The Vance media empire wasn't a kingdom to be ruled, it was a sinking ship drowning in debt. The psychological weight of the revelation hit Richard like a massive shockwave. His entire identity had been built on this inheritance. All of his aggressive corporate maneuvering, his closed-door betrayals, his hostility toward his own siblings, it was all for absolutely nothing. Evelyn watched his rapid unraveling with a calm, analytical gaze. She offered no sympathy for the man who had tried to ruin her. The papers slipped from Richard's trembling fingers, scattering wildly across the antique rug. His knees gave out. The eldest brother collapsed heavily onto the leather sofa, burying his face in his hands. The grand, ambitious CEO of Vance Media was completely gone, replaced by a broken man with nothing left to claim. The heavy oak doors of the living room creaked open, breaking the heavy silence. Mr. Sterling, the elderly family attorney, stepped slowly into the flickering firelight, his posture heavy with exhaustion. He looked down at the scattered financial documents and the completely broken heirs. With a grave voice, Sterling confessed the final layer of Arthur Vance's cruel masterpiece. The patriarch had known the empire was bankrupt long before his death, orchestrating this entire conflict intentionally. He deliberately froze the trust to force his ambitious children into a desperate, highly public war for control. Arthur wanted them to turn on each other, exposing their greed, arrogance, and ruthless tactics to the entire world. It was a calculated punishment for their lifelong sense of entitlement, ensuring their own actions would cause their ultimate downfall. Sterling gently placed a black, wax-sealed envelope onto the table, Arthur's final written confession. Having delivered the ultimate truth, the tired lawyer turned his back and walked away, leaving the siblings trapped in the ruins of their own making. The heavy oak doors clicked shut, leaving the four individuals in absolute, suffocating silence. Richard remained on the leather sofa, his eyes staring blankly into the dying embers of the fireplace. The sheer magnitude of his father's final manipulation completely broke the eldest son's lifelong arrogance. Clara slowly sank into a velvet chair, her hands trembling as she fully comprehended her permanent exile from the corporate world. She had sacrificed her personal life and betrayed her own family for an empire that never actually existed. Leo let out a hollow, bitter laugh, the sound echoing unervingly through the dark manor. He slumped onto the antique rug, staring at the spilled whiskey, realizing he had no escape from his underground creditors. Evelyn stood quietly near the coffee table, watching the Vance dynasty crumble exactly as her father had been forced to decades ago. She picked up her silver candelabra, her calm figure casting a long, dominant shadow over the defeated siblings. With her debt fully collected and the truth exposed, she turned toward the grand staircase, preparing to leave the ruins behind. Evelyn walked steadily through the dark, echoing corridors of the Vance manor, the flickering candlelight guiding her toward the grand foyer. She reached the massive marble entryway. The antique grandfather clock ticked loudly, emphasizing the sudden, heavy emptiness of the fallen estate. Stopping near the heavy oak front doors, she calmly placed the silver candelabra onto a cold marble console table. From her trench coat, she retrieved the original legal deed, the document transferring total control of the Vance Empire to her name. She stared at the paper. It was the ultimate prize, the singular obsession that had completely destroyed the three siblings inside. With a deliberate, unhurried motion, Evelyn held the corner of the legal document directly over the open flame of the candle. The thick parchment caught fire instantly. The bright orange flames consumed the printed words, turning the corporate legacy into fragile ash. She dropped the burning remains onto a silver tray. She had never wanted their tainted money, she only sought absolute justice. Leaving the ashes behind, Evelyn pushed the heavy front doors open, stepping out into the cold, cleansing European rain. Her black town car waited in the driveway. She entered the vehicle, driving away into the night, leaving the cursed manor forever. The storm passed, leaving behind a cold, crisp morning. The Vance estate stood silent, stripped of its former glory. By dawn, official bank vehicles and moving trucks had already lined the long, winding gravel driveway. A stern federal official secured a heavy padlock around the wrought iron gates, attaching a bright red foreclosure notice. Inside, the grand living room that once held the roaring fire was now completely empty, cold, and echoing. Workers systematically removed expensive antiques and classical oil paintings, packing away centuries of stolen wealth. Richard was escorted out the front doors. Wearing the same crumpled white shirt, the former CEO looked entirely defeated. Clara stood near a waiting taxi with a single piece of luggage. Stripped of her corporate armor, she looked up at the manor. Leo sat on the wet curb, staring blankly at his empty hands, the reality of his underground debts looming over him. Inside the abandoned foyer, the antique grandfather clock slowly wound down, its heavy pendulum coming to a complete stop. The three siblings stood outside the gates, completely isolated from one another, waiting to depart into an uncertain reality. Stripped of his corporate crown, Richard vanished into the crowded streets of the city. He was now just another anonymous face in the endless sea of humanity. The immense wealth that once defined his entire existence was completely gone, leaving behind a hollow, exhausted man walking aimlessly without a destination. Across the city, Clara unlocked the door to a small, modest apartment. There were no servants, no mahogany desks, and no grand corporate titles waiting for her. She slowly unpacked a single framed photograph of her family from her luggage. The glass was cracked, a perfect reflection of the dynasty she had helped destroy. Leo found no refuge. He stood at the edge of a dark, damp alleyway, his expensive clothes now entirely out of place in this unforgiving environment. Glancing nervously over his shoulder, he hurried into the shadows, forever looking over his shoulder for the underground creditors who now owned his future. In a bright, modern office miles away, Evelyn finally held her late father's silver pocket watch. The long, grueling crusade for absolute justice was over. Yet, as she looked out over the skyline, her expression remained solemnly calm. She had reclaimed the empire, but she understood the devastating cost of revenge. Back at the Vance estate, the heavy iron gates stood locked and frozen in time. The once mighty fortress was now nothing more than a quiet tomb of greed. The storm clouds gathered once again over the silent stone walls. The Vance legacy had been entirely erased, leaving behind only the haunting memory of an empire built on lies.